Hello and welcome to the CDW Canada Tech Talks podcast. I'm your host, KJ Burke, Field CTO for Hybrid Infrastructure at CDW Canada. Today we're going to discuss technology and innovation in retail, and I'm joined by Mark Scanlon, who's the global lead of retail for Cisco. How are you doing, Mark?
Good afternoon. I'm doing good, thanks, KJ. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, I really appreciate you jumping on the call today. And in the previous episodes, we talked about healthcare, and healthcare is something that everybody's interested in. Retail is maybe not as critical as healthcare in that sense, but it is something we're all interested in. And so, I appreciate you jumping on the podcast today and kind of hammering through this topic with me. One of the things I'm really blessed with on the podcast here is the people that we get to join us to go through these conversations and talk about innovation. And so maybe if you could talk a little bit about your background and your experience and how you got tied in with retail as your focus, and just help us understand you a little bit.
Sure. So I think I've worked in retail for the vast majority of my career, odd diversions along the way. But my first job out of college basically was for a large oil company based in Europe, but a large portion of my focus was on the retail presence, so the forecourts and the convenience stores, etc. Although in Europe, the convenience store is less about convenience; it's more like a full-on store. But I've gone through multiple iterations on both sides of the counter, if you like. But the last 20 or so years, I've spent with large tech companies working shoulder to shoulder with retailers in the trenches. I had a long tenure with Microsoft. I was with Motorola Solutions before the Zebra acquisition, and I've been at Cisco a combined 8 years or so now. So I've been doing this for a while.
What's really interesting with that, from my perspective, is, as you mentioned, you've seen the iterations of retail over the past couple of decades, and I think we as consumers have seen a lot of change. And so, today I kind of want to talk about, some of those historical challenges maybe we've resolved, what we're sort of focusing on today and the customer experience, and then a little bit about how we go forward in the future and how we think, retail is gonna change. So I guess when we sort of focus on the past and to the present, retail has changed in numerous ways. We've got self-checkout. We've got, a lot of loss prevention activities that are going on. We've got, pressure from online retailers and how that affects big box stores. And when we look at the different experience that we as consumers have in the retail space, how has retail changed maybe behind the scenes in ways that we as consumers wouldn't see to help, support those types of changes that maybe were a little more in our face?
Sure. Certainly when you go back into the history of retail, the industry has been very manually focused over decades. Think about your local convenience or corner store, depending what part of the world you're in. It's grown from being that very personal manual process to conglomerates. And there's a lot of things that go on in the background to support that. Top of mind today, everyone's talking about AI and what that is going to mean for retail. There's a lot around automation taking place. We've gone through a phase in the industry where we've been labor challenged. We haven't had enough labor to fill the roles. When you look at a segment of retail like QSR, quick serve restaurants, there's still a lot of restaurants out there that are working with one or two people in the location, so they can't actually open up the indoor dining. They're running drive-through only with one person on the window and one person in the kitchen. So how can we automate some of those processes in the stores? Actually, again, if you look back not so many years, maybe 5 years ago, you couldn't really talk about automation because people would immediately throw their hands up and say, oh, that means we're going to have to cut staff. That's the kind of the subtext. Now we don't have the staff to fill those roles, and automation becomes a necessity for the retailers. And we're seeing a lot of other things going on around analytics and IoT and a whole variety of things that are going on in the background to support both the associates and the operations, but also the consumer.
Yeah, and I think we're going to kind of jump into a bunch of those topics as we go through. How has data and the way that interconnect all of these devices, like up until sort of present day, how has that really changed? Because I mean, you talk about your oil and gas background. I mean, my background's mining. I remember I was just kind of coming into IT, and we were in a transition from DECnet into TCP/IP. Like we were seeing those types of changes happening. Now we're seeing, cameras. We're seeing, wireless in stores. We're seeing the ability to push advertisements or coupons to people's phones in real time. So when you think about like the back end technologies, where have organizations invested to support those types of customer engagements?
It's been really across that entire continuum. So if you pause to contrast traditional bricks and mortar stores with online, e-com, when you go through an e-com experience, the retailer knows pretty much everything about you. They know how you've entered the e-com site, how you've navigated it, what you've stopped to look at, what you've considered, maybe moved on from, what's gone in your cart, and what you've put in the cart to go with that item. So every single move throughout the e-com site has been understood, analyzed, there's metrics, etc. Not so much in a physical store. You look at, again, go back 5-6 years, the metrics were around how many people cross the threshold. So traditional, electric eyes or basic camera technology to understand how many people are entering the store. And then you've got at the other end of the shopping journey, you have the checkout. So how many of those people actually converted and went from being a browser to a buyer, and the revenue associated with that. And then obviously you've got some basic metrics around revenue per square foot and things like that. The question becomes, how can we go from that very basic, bare bones store structure and the metrics you get from that to something closer to the e-com experience? Mm-hmm. Because when we've got that experience as a retailer, then you can start to better serve your customer in terms of personalization, customization, how you engage with them, but you can also optimize your store, whether that's staffing levels, pricing, all of the different components that make up parts of the shopping journey. So it's really a journey towards an e-com-like experience, but in a physical bricks and mortar store.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think we're all used to seeing those cookies, and especially with some of the changes with some of the devices that we've had, where it now calls attention. Hey, do you really want all of these cookies? Do you want to just allow some of them to operate? And you're right. The bad is all the tracking. The good from a customer experience is, oh, hey, did you notice this is on sale today? Or hey, did you notice that you've got an opportunity to add this? Or you added this component. There's another component that generally you need along with that. And I find that if I'm doing like a home do-it-yourself project and I forget the Teflon tape because I'm doing some plumbing, I'm always disappointed. I got to run back to the store. And it's interesting when you think about it, having that constant tracking in a brick and mortar store is like having an assistant. Don't forget the Teflon tape. You're gonna regret that later, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think it's really interesting when you think about how digital commerce is now driving an experience change or at least additional data that we want to gather in that retail store. Maybe you can walk me through kind of the decision-making process that the retailers go through around trying to gather some of that information. I know you and I were talking about tracking impressions and tracking engagement, and you're right. If we're not just measuring who entered the store, who left the store, and what they happened to purchase, and we're not just saying, look, like things on this area of the shelf are more within eye level. If we get more sophisticated from that, maybe walk me through a little bit of the decision-making process that the retailers are going through when they're looking at adding these additional types of metrics into their understanding of their customers.
Sure. So I use an acronym, VIA. visibility, insights, and action. So if we focus on what the outcome is we're looking for, what action we want to come out of something, then we can back into that process. So the data is becoming richer and richer. And the thing is, we've never had a shortage of data in retail. There's always tons and tons and tons of data. Most of it is never actioned. So it becomes a question of how can we take data that we already have, typically point of sale data, we have some inventory, we have, areas of data that we can pull together. Mm-hmm. But how can we supplement that with other data to create something of value? You think about generative AI without jumping too far ahead. What people forget about generative AI, it's got to generate something. It's got to take something and make something new. That's the definition of it. So how can we take all of that data and generate those insights, analyze, generate, and come out with an action or an outcome that we're trying to drive? You talked about shelf placement as an example. In the past, we would have been thrilled to have dwell data. So somebody comes into the store and they stand in a particular location and they go, cool, they stayed there for 2 minutes. That means they must be interested in something. Well, if we think about that, if you're standing in an aisle, pick your grocery store. It's something we're all familiar with. If you're standing in an aisle, you're surrounded by products. So having a dot on a map saying KJ paused here doesn't tell you which side of the aisle you were looking at or which of the dozen items on a particular fixture you were interested in. So we're getting to a point now where we can start to look at more detailed information using things like video analytics to be able to do things like hand tracking. So what's KJ reaching out and engaging with? What is of interest? What's he picking up? What's he considering and maybe putting back on the shelf, pick up and put back? And what's going in the cart? And then builds into your profile, whether anonymously or genuinely personalized profile, if you're using the loyalty app, for example, to understand your buying behaviors and be able to engage with you while you're in the store. The example of I think you said duct tape in the hardware store, so you don't want to forget it, or Teflon tape. To be able to give you those kinds of prompts, one, we need to be able to engage backwards and forwards between the consumer and the retailer, but we also need to understand what you're doing, what you're looking at, what you're engaging with. But that data is also valuable to the retailer and to the CPG company, the consumer packaged goods company that manufactures that product. We've had some CPG companies come to us and talk to us about that engagement at the shelf or the fixture, because if you think of some of the large CPGs, they have dozens or hundreds of brands within a store. They're interested to know which ones you're engaging with as well, not just the retailer. But that becomes an exchange of value with the retailer, being able to share that data and get something in return, whether that's some sort of merchandising fee because they pay for where they sit in the aisle, or it could be some mutual benefit in terms of how they position product relative to one another in the merchandising plan that becomes the planogram.
Yeah, and so maybe tell me a little bit about how that type of information is shared, because I think when I think about it, I generally think of the store and I'm buying from the store, but you're right. In reality, the store is kind of an aggregation of all sorts of other organizations that have placed their items within that store. Do you see a lot more integration, or do you see a lot more sharing of that data between the brick and mortar store and the product? And does that become a bit of a differentiator between different brick and mortar stores for those partners that are selling?
All great points. So there's increasing amounts of data sharing going on, whether that's through some hubs designed specifically for data exchange, but also direct engagement between the retailer and the CPG. Think of the beer vendor or the bread vendor who delivers directly to the store. Sodas. That's probably a good example. A few months ago, I was in my local grocery store on a Saturday afternoon, busiest time of the week, and there was somebody from one of the large soda companies who also does potato chips, and they were blocking the aisle with a roll tainer full of potato chips, and they were doing a hard counter, a physical inventory of what was on the shelf. Whereas I, as a human being, could look at it and say, yeah, that's probably about 75, 80% full. And in that case, you really don't need to be there. Particularly it's a busy time of the week where you're blocking the aisle. So that goes into supply chain and ensuring that the right items are being delivered to the store at the right time. But also there's a sustainability aspect to that. You have an individual who's driven a good-sized truck to the store, consuming fuel, producing pollution, obviously spending labor time as well in being there, when in fact they really didn't need to be there. So if we were taking video data or other data and sharing that directly with that CPG provider who's doing direct replenishment, then we could have said, you know what, you don't need to be here today. Come on Monday or Tuesday when we're going to be down to predictably 25% maybe of inventory on the shelf, and makes it far more efficient. So there's all sorts of sharing that can go on between obviously the store and the distribution center, but also the store and other vendors who may provide product to the store.
It's a really interesting line of thought, because again, and that's one of the things I like about the podcast, and I see Greg, our editor, nodding along a little bit too every once in a while when we hit an interesting point, because it's not something I would have thought about. It's not an aspect of retail that I really would think about, the sharing of data and how that can really sort of cause a bit of differentiation between maybe large, mature selling organizations and smaller mom and pop organizations as well. That's interesting. So, another thing that we tend to see is like experience locations within a storefront. Like, for instance, maybe an area where they're doing cooking lessons, or maybe mixology courses or things like that. What are some of the ways that storefronts maybe have an advantage over e-commerce that we're starting to see leverage, that they're also gathering data from? Maybe walk me through some of those.
Absolutely. So retail is one of those industries that's experiential. You can go on to your favorite e-com site and you can buy stuff, but you can't really experience it. So, if you are looking for an item of clothing, some new electronics, maybe. Electronics is probably one of the better examples. You want to go into the store and you want to hear those speakers or see that TV screen and experience it. And yes, some of the e-com sites will do kind of a try before you buy or free returns, whatever it may be, but there's a lag in that experience. Most people want immediate gratification. So they want to go in the store, they want to look at it and go, wow, that's a really cool TV. I'm going to take that home with me. And, that is really one of the drivers. And in fact, my own team, the retail team, is coming together with Cisco's hospitality and sports media and entertainment team to form a single team, because those are all experiential industries which we're seeing more and more frequently together. So think about sports stadiums. We are both a sponsor, but obviously the technology provider for SoFi Stadium down outside of LA, and that's the stadium itself, an entertainment venue. There's retail within the stadium, concessions and fan stores and what have you, but then when you look at the surrounding area, you have Hollywood Park, which is retail, it's hotels, it's casinos, it's all of these different experiential areas that can draw people in and be a magnet that e-com can never ever provide. We were playing around, and I think it really was playing around with metaverse and being able to do full VR selling experiences. And there are certainly areas where you can do that. I've seen some interesting projects around, say, kitchen design, where you can go in, plan out your kitchen with a professional, and then put on. In fact, you guys can see it. Obviously, the folks on the podcast can't. I've got an Oculus behind me where you can immerse yourself into a retail experience, but it's still not quite the same as going and experiencing it firsthand.
Yeah, and I've seen that with it's interesting, the concept around you're shopping for an experience. And you're right, when you think about if I go to a concert and I want to remember that experience, obviously buying a t-shirt for the band, don't wear the band's t-shirt to the concert, but you can buy a t-shirt for the band at the concert, right? And that is an experience. And it's interesting because you were talking about that, and I was thinking about as a kid going into like Toys R Us and that experience of having all of those things that I could tactically touch and feel. And it was definitely a different shopping experience than something like an e-commerce site. And so I think you sort of leaning into that as a brick and mortar store is definitely an interesting approach.
And in fact, you're starting to see stores now. In fact, I'm saying starting. It's been going on for a few years, but it's been increasing in popularity. Is experiential, call them locations rather than stores, where they don't actually sell anything. You can't go in and buy it and take it home. So it's kind of that blending of the e-com and the bricks and mortar. You can go in, maybe a smaller format store, so they're not paying for all the square footage, but you can go in, you can try things out, whether it's a TV or whatever it may be. You go, I like this and I want to buy it, and they say, okay, fine, we'll have it delivered to you tomorrow at home. So they don't hold any stock, which has obviously business benefits in terms of stock on hand and investments in that. That's all coming out of a central fulfillment location direct to your home.
And I've seen that with, I think there was a solar roofing company that was able to take a picture of your house off of Google Maps and then show you what it would look like with different configurations. Or there's some car companies out there that, I actually ran into a car company at a mall where they had, a couple of models of their car, like in the mall where you could take a look at them. But you're right, when you decide to buy, you're ordering for something that's going to deliver months from then. But I think the important part is being able to get hands-on. I'm not going to make an investment in an automobile without actually, seeing it in person, sitting in it, making sure that it's going to meet my needs, because it's too big of an investment to just do over, online, right?
And there's the human aspect as well. So obviously you have the option for engagement through a website with a human, but it's not the same as face-to-face engagement, and that's part of the automation story as well. The more we can automate in the store, the kind of the mundane, repetitive tasks, the more time we free up for the associate to do the really valuable stuff, which is engaging with customers. Think about luxury retail. If you go into a handbag store or whatever line of luxury retail we're talking about, it's going to be personalized attention. You're a client. They're going to be using clienteling software to understand everything you've ever bought before and what may go with that. Nice shoes to go with the suits you purchased 6 months ago, or whatever it may be. So that personalized aspect really does make a difference. And in some cases, we're able to do that through technology, whether that's through a website or through the consumer's handheld device, because obviously there's a scaling issue. Luxury retail, there are fewer people going into the store, and there's a reasonable supply of associates. You go into a home improvement store, and it can be a real challenge finding somebody to help you locate that widget and whatever associated parts you need to go with it. So being able to engage through, say, a mobile app or a screen in aisle may make all the difference to closing that sale and converting that customer.
Yeah, and you're right, especially when you're dealing at a big scale, that close rate has got to be something not only to sort of have a metric by, but also a focus for wanting to improve, right? So One of the things you mentioned earlier that I kind of want to circle back to and talk about the importance of is cyber vision when we look at cameras and the use of cameras in retail. And I think we've all looked up and we see cameras and I think our initial thought around that is there's cameras there for loss prevention. But as you mentioned here, there's a whole bunch of other uses that those cameras have, especially as we start to pair that cyber vision, that computer vision with AI, with analytics, with looking at the patterns of behavior that people have, dwell time, like you mentioned some of those things. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about cameras and the vital role that they play in sort of gathering data and helping retailers and consumers.
Absolutely. And there are several things that are interlinked. You have the cameras themselves as a kind of a super sensor. It's an IoT device, but it's capturing video rather than open close on a refrigerator door or whatever. You've got the AI that's going to do the analytics. You've got the IoT component, and you've got the automation that may come from it. Again, if you're thinking about the visibility, insights, and action, what can we see? What can we understand from that? And what are we going to do about it? Most importantly, the cameras really are a super sensor. From counting people, looking at demographics, looking at dwell and fixture interaction, and you mentioned specifically loss prevention there as well. And I've stopped talking about loss prevention as a term because it doesn't prevent anything generally. It's really loss recording is what we're talking about. And if we look back at the challenges we're seeing around labor, loss prevention, in quotes, is not immune to the labor challenges. So we're seeing increasing rates of loss and theft within the stores and a decreasing pool of LP professionals who can investigate it. And typically, we're looking at a human sitting in front of a screen, looking at hours and hours and hours of video, hoping to see something which is evidentiary. What we're trying to do is, by combining the cameras and the AI, is be able to move from that passive loss recording position into one where we can do active loss and fraud detection. And at that point, if we can detect something that is suspicious, whether it's truly loss or fraud or not, that's another question. But if we can detect something that is a suspicious action, then we can package it up, have a 30 or 60-second clip of video with all of the data points associated with that attached to that particular package, bundle it up, put a bow on the top, and send it to an LP professional to review. And they may say, no, that's perfectly okay, and dismiss it. But if not, then they're able to go directly to that incident and make themselves far more efficient in the process. So one example is around returns fraud. So a good portion of loss in the store is attributable to the associates. It's not just customers. So either associates perpetrated or associates assisted. So returns fraud is one of those associate perpetrated generally. So if they're standing at the customer service counter, they look around, it's all quiet, and they pick up something that's already been returned, scan it for a cash return, throw it back in the bin behind them, and take the cash and put it in the pocket. Very common occurrence. But by tying into the point of sale, being able to identify specific higher risk categories of transaction, and then marry that to the video and look for how many people are in frame as a basic measure. If there's only one person, that's the associate, because the register just opened. A consumer can't do that. Therefore, that is a high-risk transaction to flag and forward on. So that's marrying the smarts of the camera with an existing system and doing that all in one. And the beauty now with the smart cameras is you don't have to stream all of that video somewhere else, whether it's to a server in the store or up to the cloud. And honestly, most retailers don't have the bandwidth to stream it to the cloud. Then process it only to find there's nothing of interest. Whereas with the smart cameras, the AI is sitting on the camera and it's doing 90% of the work for you to be able to identify things that are of interest. And if the AI model is small enough, it can run entirely on the camera. If it's more intense model, then you can put a triage on the camera that's looking for things that may be of interest. So the 60% of the day when your aisle is empty, then we just ignore that video. But when you see somebody and you see them reach out to a fixture, then you say, oh, okay, that's of interest. Let's package that up and send that off for further review, whether that's by a human or by a bigger AI model. So it's really about the efficiencies and being able to, again, drive automation of what have been historically very labor-intensive tasks.
Yeah, and I think that one of the themes that we've seen through all of the various sort of podcasts, one of the themes that we see as we talk to customers and we talk to industry experts is the whole concept around digitization and being able to take these manual processes, as you mentioned, labor-intensive processes. And one of the really good uses that we're seeing for AI is using AI and being able to trim down the amount of data that we have to look at manually. And so absolutely, whether that's, I know one of the other loss prevention areas that organizations struggle with is UPC spoofing and somebody coming in with a UPC sticker and they're scanning something, paying for something, but it's not the item that they're actually putting in their shopping cart. It's something that has a much lower cost. And to your point, being able to correlate what's being scanned in real time with a digital camera video of what the item actually is something that has to be done, in real time in order to be able to catch those types of scammers. And so I think the idea of return scams and knowing that, again, you're trying to correlate an item and an activity and a location and people counting all together into a framework that really helps identify risky situations. And maybe you have a situation like that a dozen times a day, but you're not looking through 12 hours of footage to then try to identify those manually. So yeah, I think it's fascinating the way that all comes together.
Absolutely. And all of this, apart from being about automation, it's also about risk mitigation. Mm-hmm. So being able to identify those situations, those actions or activities that may be of concern. So that extends beyond loss and fraud into safety, for example, whether that is occupational safety for associates, maybe somebody in a warehouse driving a forklift into an area that's checkered off on the floor for safety reasons, or any number of issues that can happen within the store. So there's one particular retailer who has had over $20 million in penalties from the Oversight Bureau, who looks at occupational safety. When we look at what they were actually being fined for, it was for things like blocking aisles, blocking fire exits, blocking firefighting equipment, and as a result, they were being fined for those particular instances per incident, and over I think a 5-year period or so, it was about $20 million in fines. So being able to identify these kinds of occurrences, undesirable occurrences within the store, is significant value to the retailer as well.
Yeah, and that's a good call out too, because I think that when I think of the cameras that we put into, whether it's in an office space, whether it's retail, whether it's smart cities, when I think about cameras, they're kind of a Swiss Army knife. You said super sensor earlier, which I really like, because I think that people don't quite understand sometimes that you can set up one camera and it may be doing a dozen different things. I mean, you may be pulling that data feed in, having analyzed in multiple different layers for your loss prevention, for your safety and health, for gathering, customer metrics and dwell time. And by having that sort of super sensor there, it really is like having, somebody's eyes on it all the time.
And the thing has been, when you see these clusters of cameras up on the ceiling in a store, it's frequently because there are little fiefdoms within the retailer. So, there's LP and there's merchandising and there's all, different groups who may say, oh, we want data from the store. Okay, that's fine. But you don't each need your own camera to do it. And heaven help you if you actually ask, one of the other groups, hey, I'd like some data off your camera. No, not going to happen. So if we can move the cameras out of the particular departments and just have them as a part of the infrastructure that can be drawn on, just like the network or various other technology things that all you're doing is consuming data from it, then all of a sudden we have the ability to be able to apply that particular device to multiple use cases, which ultimately saves the retailer money in the long term.
Yeah, I think it also makes them look a lot less paranoid when you walk in and there's like a cluster of cameras all pointing in different directions, right?
I have seen some proof of concept stores where they were trying to get very, very granular on video data, and they've put cameras on drop poles above each of the fixtures, probably 3-meter intervals. But what becomes very obvious as the consumer is the camera, because it's almost in your face, at which point there goes your experience. So again, we're back to retail as an experience. If you've got a camera in your face, you're less likely to go shop there. So it's striking the right balance between being able to understand behaviors and take action on those, but while making it a pleasant experience for the consumer to go into.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. You're right. You don't want your consumers to be uncomfortable. So we talked, so I think that was a good breakdown of cameras, and I think it's also important to understand that cameras aren't always there just for loss prevention. There's all sorts of other use cases. What are some of the other sensors that we see? I mean, you talked about sort of in-out sensors. I mean, one of the things that we talk about fairly regularly is digitization of like janitorial services, or finding ways to measure how the performance of your coolers or your refrigerators or your like in real time, without having have somebody like go around with a checklist and check all of those chillers and refrigerators. What are some of the other sensors that are pretty common that you see really drive a lot of value for retailers?
Yeah, I mean, you hit on some temperature sensors, and there's obviously a variety of flavors of temperature sensor. But you think about, again, if we talk about grocery, because everyone's familiar with it, if you think about your local store, chances are they may have hot plates where maybe they have a selection of hot foods for you to take away. They obviously have meat and proteins. They have other types of refrigeration, both in the back of the store, but on the store floor itself. And it's a serious commitment of labor to go around and probe these various storage locations throughout the day. There's an expectation that they will be probed, so many times, and you may have dozens of locations that you need to probe. Isn't it better, logically, to put in a fixed sensor that will raise a flag if your temperatures go out of bounds, and potentially correct the problem before it becomes a spoilage issue for the store? So, if that hot food drops below a certain temperature, you've got to throw it away. That's health and safety requirements. But what if you can stop it before it gets there? Same goes for your refrigeration. If you maybe got a sensor on the refrigerator door and a temperature sensor inside, and the temperature of your refrigeration has been dropping by 0.5 degree per hour for the last 4 hours, yet the door hasn't been opened during that time, then chances are you may have a mechanical issue. And you may want to automatically send a message to the department manager saying, hey, you want to move this product from this refrigerator to this one, so that you don't lose $1,000 worth of product sitting in the refrigerator, and put in an automated trouble ticket to have somebody come and service it. You can go beyond that as well. You can have sensors for things like vibration that could sit on the compressor of that refrigerator. But the same goes, and again, we're talking a lot about stores, but what about the distribution sensors? You have conveyor belts, you have all sorts of mechanical moving items within a distribution center. Now we have AGVs, automated guided vehicles, driving around distribution centers, moving pallets of stuff around. These are all things that need to be censored to ensure that we are getting the optimal performance from those devices, and that they don't need preventative maintenance, because if they fail, it's probably going to take longer and be more costly to repair them than it is to do preventative maintenance. I was talking with one retailer, very large retailer. They said that for every minute of downtime at their distribution center, it costs them about $40,000. Mm-hmm. And if you can find the right person, and generally it's not in the IT organization, but if you can find the right person, they can give you the key metrics for their business, such as $40,000 per minute of downtime. We can do the same with retail operations for registers, or an entire store down, for example. All sorts of different things we can look at. And again, the idea is so that we can gain observability into the entire space, not just the network, but into the whole operation, so we can look for where there may be issues coming up that we can address before they become a problem.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. I think that's also relevant beyond retail. And, in mining, we always ran into the challenge where preventive maintenance was something we would plan for. We'd get the right tools available. We're doing it in a fixed location in the workshop or in the truck shop. And so you have everything you need there to not only do the maintenance, but do it in an efficient way. So once you're trying to fix that autonomous vehicle in the row as opposed to back in the shop, again, you don't have all the tools there. It becomes challenging. It also becomes a roadblock. You could end up with a situation where it's now impeding the productivity of everyone that's trying to work around it. I also like that you brought up the workflow, because it's not just about the sensors, it's about the workflow behind the sensors. What are you triggering? How are you using that data to then, make your operation more effective, or your storefront more effective? And the other thing I've mentioned to some customers I've talked to about, IoT and sensors is maybe you're running hundreds of stores, and maybe you have different manufacturers of those refrigerators at those different stores. And maybe you want to say, well, is one manufacturer actually have better uptime than the other? Am I starting to see, we occasionally would have problems where we would get a whole batch of equipment that maybe was just not manufactured to the specifications it's supposed to be, and you had early failure. And when you could actually find and prove that there was a component that was not manufactured appropriately, then you could actually go back to the manufacturer and say, hey, you're supposed to get this sort of uptime, your equipment's not meeting that. But without having that information, you can never pull together all of that data. You just have these sort of ad hoc stories where, okay, well, we think that this refrigerator unit is maybe not as good as this other one, but it's all anecdotal. You don't actually have the hard data to prove that.
And actually, something you said there triggered another thought. So, provenance of products. So, understanding where they came from, where they were either manufactured or grown. Obviously, particularly an issue in grocery. If we think back, I think it was probably nearly 2 years ago now, there was a massive recall of romaine lettuce. There was some contamination. Nobody knew where it had come from. They didn't know where it had gone to. So literally it was a blanket directive. Okay, all retailers, all consumers, throw out your romaine. And then there was a level of distrust after the fact. So when it started to come back into the stores, can I really trust what I'm buying in my store, or is it now going to sit on the shelf and go bad because nobody's picking it up? So that's another use of IoT, being able to really follow the provenance of a product potentially all the way back to a field in a farm. I was working with a brand of salad manufacturer, and they wanted to understand where a particular head of lettuce came from. So being able to say, okay, we're going to pick a particular piece of produce, we're going to put it into a basket, and that basket is tagged. Being able to then take that basket, put it onto a pallet, which goes onto a truck, which goes into a distribution center, and being able to build that hierarchy and understand where it came from. So if you have one bad head of lettuce or a contaminated head of lettuce in a store, you can actually track it all the way back to maybe a contaminated water source in one field, in one farm. So, there's all sorts of use cases around that. Retail pharmacy is also a good one there. Understanding if there's a product recall, is it the whole product? Or is it a particular batch or lot from a particular factory that's got into the supply chain?
And I think you're right. I mean, lineage and then impact are sort of the two things I'm hearing there. And if you can't trim down and really identify the source of the issue, that's a good call out. You may have to get rid of an entire line of product. And that's obviously costly for everybody. It's costly to consumers, it's costly to the business, it's costly to the farm. Absolutely. So I want to pivot to sort of future state. And obviously, we can't predict the future. You see trends and you see things that are happening. You're talking with some of your retail customers and you see kind of what they're doing. But I think it's important that we sort of sketch out, what does that look like as we move forward? So, talking a little bit around, in the retail space, what are you seeing that we as consumers will start to see as we start to, change the technologies that are out there, as we start to continue to innovate, in the retail storefronts? What do you think we're going to notice, the next sort of 5 to 10 years that's going to be driving that really positive consumer experience?
Sure. So many things that could change and may not. So, we've already seen, there was a big swing towards things like self-check. And there's a number of large retailers around the globe who are now reversing that trend. So, there are things that seemed like a good idea at the time and maybe had a good business reason, labor being one of them, for putting in self-check. But ultimately, maybe it backfires because the consumer realizes they've lost that personal interaction. In fact, if you look on Facebook, you'll probably find some friend somewhere complaining about having to go through a self-check. And I'm doing the retailer's job for them. So, there's a pendulum that swings. Sometimes it's embracing technology, sometimes it's not so much, it's more towards the personal touch. I think longer term, we're going to see a demand for frictionless or lower friction, at least, retail. Maybe not full autonomous, like the Amazon Go stores. Again, that's a pendulum that's swung and is swinging back because they're very technology intensive. You potentially have tens, if not hundreds of cameras, depending on the size of the store, in conjunction with shelf sensors and all of this other stuff that's actually really expensive and make it uneconomical for most stores. But there are other forms of frictionless. For example, pay at the pump. If you're filling up your vehicle and you have your loyalty card and you're driving your regular vehicle that you've registered the license plate with, maybe that's all the authentication that you need to be able to charge that tank of gas to your account. So I think areas like that may be of interest. We're seeing that increasingly in things like curbside pickup, doing things like the license plate recognition, although some retailers are, even though it's perfectly legal, are a little leery of looking at your license plate. They're concerned that there may be litigation that ultimately will fail because it's a legal thing for you to look at, but it's still a cost of litigation. So instead, they're looking at the unique attributes of your vehicle. So, make, model, color, distinguishing features, and we're doing that for drive-through optimization for a number of QSRs. So you can track a vehicle's journey through the drive-through with the intent of really shortening the service time. So that's the benefit to the consumer. Understanding the ebbs and flows of the drive-through, prioritizing and promoting lower prep time items when the line's longer to reduce service time and keep the line flowing, that kind of thing. I think we're going to see a growth in AI and not the Skynet Terminator type AI, but those that are there hopefully to help us in our shopping decisions. You talked about adjacent products. If I buy peanut butter, maybe I want to buy jelly as well, and I've forgotten to put it in my basket, or things like that. But basically, ways of streamlining the customer journey. And another area where AI will play is in customer service. So we see increasing call volumes to contact centers, and the queue time is growing. I know I had challenges last week. I had some storm damage from the big winter storm that came through, or spring storm, I guess, that came through. We were without power and internet for days, and trying to call into a contact center was a nightmare. You were on hold for over an hour, and there was no option in their workflow to get a call back or to get a link sent to me that allowed me to log a ticket through my mobile device, for example. So I think increasing use of AI in those contact center environments where you're able to get an increased rate of first line resolution only goes to serve the customer. They may be, some people may be a little reticent around using AI for that. They'd rather interact with a human. Okay, that I get it. That's entirely your choice. If you want to stay on hold for 60 minutes, have at it. I'd rather the system send me something that helped me deal with that issue as quickly as possible. So I think those are some of the big areas. We've seen ebbs and flows in AR and VR over the last few years. I still think there's a place particularly for augmented reality in the physical locations, being able to do overlays, for example, in an aisle, and get additional information on a product, or trying to locate a product. That's a big one. You think about doing your curbside order, and half the time they put some of the newest folks on the picking task to go around and pick your order for you. And it takes them twice as long because they don't know where anything is. They may be the right aisle, but the item may not be where they expect it to be in that aisle. So being able to augment that process and following that theme, automation in the stores, again, trying to give associates time back to do more valuable activities like engage with the consumer. Something you mentioned earlier that actually came up on one of my broader team calls the other day. We're all consumers. We all go to stores, and we see a very discrete portion of the retail journey and the retail business. We go in, we look at product, we pick it up, we take it to the register, and from our perspective as consumers, that is the retail experience. We don't think about all the things that go on behind the scenes. There's merchandising teams and marketing and store operations and supply chain, all of these different groups that are kind of loops off of that journey that both consume data that's being generated by the store or by the consumer, but then feed back into it. So price optimization and stock level optimization are a couple of those areas that are taking data from the store and from the consumer journey, processing that, and then feeding back into that process to be able to deliver the right product at the right price, in that case, to the consumer next time they come into the store. So that's an area we can delve into on another podcast if that's something of interest.
Yeah, and I appreciate that view of the future because I think that, again, like retail is something we're all invested with. And one of the things you talked about earlier that I think kind of comes back into this sort of future of retail is that customized experience that I'm looking for when I go to a retail storefront, whether that's tied to an event, whether that's tied to just my shopping experience, whether that's I'm making an investment and I want to get hands-on and tactile with what I'm going to be investing in. I think it's a really interesting way of viewing it, that I hadn't really, thought about before. I also think augmented reality would be really interesting. It'd be really interesting also to have a digital clothing assistant. Like, I'm not the most stylish person. I'd love to have somebody suggest color coordination because, clothing style is not something that I'm, up to date on. So, I have to rely on my daughter for most of that. Mark, I really appreciate you jumping on the call today and being part of the podcast. I appreciate your view and kind of where you're at and who you're talking to and bringing some of those ideas. So I just want to say thank you. Thanks for joining me today. And, Mark Scanlon, Global Lead for Retail at Cisco. Really appreciate you being on the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me, KJ. Anytime, give me a shout and I'll come on back.
Thanks. Yeah, we will probably do that. So for those of you listening, I've been your host, KJ Burke. Thank you for joining me on the podcast today, and appreciate you being a part of the CDW Canada Tech Talks podcast.